What if the silence you are facing right now is not rejection but resistance? What if the distance you are feeling is not the end but the start of realization? Because in the unconscious mind, absence does something that presence cannot do in the same way. It pushes truth upward. It brings hidden emotion into awareness. And the person you believe has stepped away may actually be going through an internal process that prepares a return. If this connects with your experience, stay with this message. Because what comes next is not about chasing anyone. It is about understanding the hidden psychological patterns behind why people come back when silence starts to feel louder than presence. When someone is emotionally attached but cannot fully understand or process that attachment consciously, the mind reacts in subtle but strong ways. It pushes internal conflict outward. Instead of clearly thinking, "I miss this person," or "I feel fear of losing them," the mind redirects those emotions into behavior that is indirect or even confusing. This is why attachment is not simple in psychology. It rarely shows up in a clean or direct form. It gets filtered through mental defenses. In projection of attachment, a person might appear distant on the outside while still feeling pulled inward. They may act like they do not care, yet internally they experience strong mental activity, repeated thoughts, emotional replay, and unconscious comparison between having someone present and losing them. The human mind often struggles when it holds two opposite emotional truths at the same time. One side wants independence and control, the other side fears emotional loss. To reduce this inner pressure, the mind pushes emotional weight outward. It may rationalize distance or reduce the importance of the connection, even while still reacting emotionally underneath. This is why outward behavior can be misleading. What you see is not always what the mind is actively processing. The unconscious part of the mind continues the emotional relationship even when the conscious self tries to detach. It builds symbolic replacements, like revisiting old memories, replaying conversations, or giving new emotional meaning to past moments that once felt ordinary. In this condition, moving closer or moving away is not purely logical or strategic. It becomes a way of balancing internal discomfort. The psyche tries to restore emotional stability. When attachment feels threatened, the mind does not simply release it easily. Instead, it reorganizes perception so the emotional system can handle the stress. This is why distance can sometimes increase emotional focus instead of reducing it. The bond does not disappear. It moves inward, gets processed in a hidden way, and often comes back later through renewed contact when internal resistance becomes weaker. The tension created by absence reveals something most people only recognize when silence feels emotionally stronger than actual interaction. When someone is present, the mind usually runs on familiarity. It adapts, assumes stability, and reduces urgency. But when that presence decreases or disappears, the mind reacts differently. It registers the gap not as something neutral, but as a disruption. This disruption activates a deeper emotional layer. The mind starts reviewing what was once taken for granted. It replays moments, rechecks conversations, and reassesses meaning that earlier felt simple or unimportant. Things that felt small during real interaction often become significant when absence appears. This happens because the brain does not measure attachment clearly in comfort. It measures it through contrast. Loss creates contrast, and contrast increases emotional awareness. Emotional dependence is not always visible until the stable pattern is removed. When that stability breaks, the nervous system starts trying to restore balance again. That attempt can show up as restlessness, curiosity, or resistance to fully accepting the distance. One important effect of absence is that it removes the constant feedback loop that presence provides. Without that steady loop, the mind fills the space with internal thoughts. It builds meaning, questions past choices, and imagines possible outcomes that were never previously considered. So absence does not reduce emotional connection. In many cases, it increases internal focus on it. The emotional system becomes more active instead of less active. And the stronger the original attachment is, the stronger this internal reaction becomes. This often leads a person to move toward emotional resolution simply to reduce the discomfort created by uncertainty and separation. The resistance of the ego to emotional loss is one of the most automatic psychological reactions in human behavior. The ego is not just pride or self-image. It is the structure the mind uses to maintain identity, stability, and continuity. When a meaningful emotional bond feels like it is breaking, the ego does not treat it as a simple emotional event. It sees it as a disruption in internal order. Loss forces the ego into uncertainty. It removes the belief that emotional connections are fully under control. This creates internal imbalance, and the mind naturally tries to fix that imbalance. Instead of accepting loss immediately, the ego pushes back using defense patterns like justification, denial, emotional minimization, or sudden emotional return after seeming detachment. What makes this resistance complex is that it is often unconscious. A person may say they do not care, yet still feel strong internal tension. The ego tries to protect self-image by avoiding vulnerability, but emotional systems continue to register attachment at the same time. This creates internal conflict. That conflict is uncomfortable, and discomfort pushes the mind to reconsider. The human mind does not easily stay in unresolved emotional tension. When something important feels like it is being lost, the ego begins searching for ways to regain balance without feeling like it is losing control. This is why resistance often comes before reconnection. First, the ego rejects the idea of loss, but as discomfort increases, it slowly becomes more open to rethinking what was pushed away. Eventually, what was denied externally starts becoming undeniable internally. In simple terms, the ego does not resist because it feels nothing. It resists because it feels something strongly. And inside that resistance, the possibility of return often begins to form quietly. Intermittent reinforcement is one of the strongest psychological forces behind emotional attachment and pursuit behavior. It happens when emotional responses are not consistent. Sometimes there is attention, sometimes distance, sometimes warmth, sometimes silence. This unpredictability has a deep effect on the nervous system. It prevents emotional closure. When emotional patterns are stable and predictable, the mind slowly relaxes. It learns what to expect and reduces urgency. But when emotional signals are inconsistent, the brain stays alert. It keeps scanning for patterns, trying to predict what comes next. This creates a cycle of anticipation and uncertainty. That cycle strengthens attachment instead of reducing it. The key factor is not intensity, but unpredictability. Even small emotional moments, if they appear randomly, can have a stronger impact than steady attention. The mind begins to value the possibility of connection more than the connection itself. Over time, this forms a loop where absence increases desire and brief presence increases emotional intensity. The system becomes conditioned to keep seeking resolution, but that resolution never feels stable enough. Because of this, detachment does not happen easily. The mind keeps returning to unfinished emotional signals, not because of logic, but because of conditioning. The nervous system has been trained to stay engaged. Until consistency or clear closure replaces unpredictability, the mind continues to interpret distance, not as an ending, but as part of a continuing emotional pattern that still needs resolution. The shadow of regret appears when emotional distance forces a person to face what they did not fully appreciate during the time of presence. In Jungian terms, the shadow is not something purely evil or destructive. It is everything the conscious mind does not fully recognize or accept about itself. Regret often belongs to this hidden psychological layer because it holds truths that the ego initially avoids confronting or integrating. When a connection starts to fade or lose strength, the conscious mind may first react through justification, rationalization, or emotional detachment. It tries to explain the change in a way that feels controlled or acceptable. However, the unconscious does not work through justification. It works through emotional truth. Slowly, it begins to bring back suppressed impressions, small moments of care that were not fully valued, emotional support that once felt ordinary, or the quiet stability that only became noticeable when it started disappearing. Regret does not appear all at once. It develops gradually, almost silently, not as a single realization but as an accumulation of internal reflections. It grows through comparison between what was once available and what is no longer present. This comparison activates emotional memory more strongly than logical memory. The mind does not only recall events, it re-experiences the emotional tone connected to those events. As this shadow aspect becomes stronger, it starts to influence behavior in indirect ways. A person may appear calm or neutral on the outside, yet internally they may repeatedly revisit past interactions with a changed interpretation. Things that once seemed minor or unimportant can suddenly feel meaningful or emotionally significant. This shift is not random or accidental. It reflects the psyche attempting to correct its earlier lack of awareness or emotional blindness. The shadow of regret also creates an inner tension between pride and recognition. Pride resists accepting loss or emotional vulnerability, while recognition pushes toward acknowledging emotional truth. This internal opposition keeps the connection psychologically active, even when physical distance or separation already exists. Eventually, regret becomes a motivating force within the psyche. It may not always be visible in behavior, but it operates underneath awareness. It pushes the mind toward resolution, toward deeper understanding, and often toward reconsideration of what was previously dismissed too quickly or without full emotional awareness. Attachment before awareness describes a fundamental psychological pattern in human relationships, where emotional bonding forms long before a person consciously understands its depth, meaning, or long-term value. People rarely recognize the importance of a connection while they are still fully inside it. Instead, they tend to experience it as something normal, expected, or simply part of their emotional environment. The mind has a natural tendency to normalize what is consistently present. When something feels stable and predictable, it moves into the background of awareness rather than remaining in focus. This is not emotional neglect, it is cognitive adaptation. The psyche conserves attention by not constantly analyzing what appears secure. Because of this, emotional importance often remains unexamined until that sense of stability is disrupted or removed. Awareness, in contrast, is usually triggered by contrast. When presence turns into absence, or when familiarity turns into distance, the mind is forced to reassess what it previously labeled as ordinary. Only at that point does the emotional system begin to assign deeper value to what already existed. This delay between attachment and awareness creates a psychological gap. The bond forms first on an emotional level, but its meaning is often only fully understood later through reflection, separation, or change. In this sense, awareness is frequently retrospective rather than immediate. What makes this pattern powerful is that it shows how emotional truth is not always accessible in real time. The psyche often requires experience, contrast, and sometimes absence in order to fully interpret what it had already formed internally. This is why people can feel confusion after separation, because understanding tends to arrive after emotional investment has already taken place. In essence, attachment is usually immediate and unconscious, while awareness is delayed and reflective. It is within this delay that realization, longing, and re-evaluation begin to emerge. The unconscious negotiation is a silent psychological process that begins when emotional attachment is disrupted but not fully resolved. It is not a conscious decision-making process. Instead, it unfolds beneath awareness as the mind tries to restore internal balance. When a bond becomes uncertain or fractured, the psyche does not immediately settle into acceptance or detachment. Instead, it enters a phase of internal dialogue between competing emotional forces. On one side there is attachment, memory, familiarity, emotional imprint, and the comfort of what is known. On the other side there is self-protection, pride, avoidance of vulnerability, and the need to regain emotional control. These two forces do not resolve quickly. They continuously interact, creating a subtle but persistent psychological tension that the individual may not fully recognize. During this phase, silence becomes psychologically active. What is not expressed outwardly is still being processed internally. The mind revisits past moments, reinterprets their meaning, and tests emotional scenarios. What was real? What was lost? What still holds importance? This is not logical analysis. It is emotional recalibration taking place beneath conscious awareness. The negotiation also involves identity. The psyche begins to ask, often indirectly, what does this loss say about me? Or what do I risk by returning? These questions are not always spoken in words, but they strongly influence emotional movement and inner direction. Eventually, one side of this internal negotiation starts to dominate. If attachment becomes stronger than resistance, the emotional system moves toward reconnection. If resistance becomes stronger, detachment is reinforced, although rarely without some emotional residue remaining. This is why outcomes after emotional distance are rarely completely neutral. Even when someone appears unchanged externally, something internal has shifted. The unconscious negotiation ensures that emotional experiences continue processing long after external contact has ended, gradually guiding future behavior toward resolution, correction, or possible return. Individuation through separation is a deep psychological process in which distance becomes a catalyst for self-realization. In Jungian terms, individuation is the unfolding of the self beyond dependency, projection, and unconscious identification. It is the movement from emotional fusion toward inner wholeness. When a significant connection exists, parts of the self can become projected onto the other person, Identity, meaning, and emotional stability may be partially placed outside the self without conscious awareness. In such relationships, the connection becomes not only emotional but also psychological, organizing inner experience through external attachment. Because of this, self-understanding remains incomplete, since it is partly reflected and shaped by another person's presence. Separation interrupts this structure. It removes the external reference point that the psyche was using for emotional orientation. At first, this disruption creates discomfort, confusion, or resistance because the mind loses a familiar source of emotional regulation. However, this disruption is not only loss, it is also exposure. Without external attachment shaping perception, the individual is gradually pushed inward. Thoughts that were previously projected outward begin returning for integration. Emotions that were once regulated through connection must now be processed internally. This is where individuation begins to take form. Over time, separation reveals what was truly self-generated and what was relational projection. It clarifies the boundaries of identity. A person begins to distinguish between what they felt because of the relationship and what they feel as an independent self. This process is not immediate. It unfolds through reflection, emotional processing, and gradual psychological restructuring. But its outcome is clarity, an internal sense of wholeness that no longer depends on external validation, presence, or emotional reinforcement. In this way, separation is not only the ending of a connection, but also the beginning of deeper psychological integration. The illusion slowly dissolves. What once felt like distance begins to transform into clarity. What once felt like silence begins to reveal meaning, because the psyche does not abandon what it has emotionally invested in. Instead, it continues to reprocess it until resolution becomes unavoidable. So when withdrawal is experienced, it should not automatically be mistaken for conclusion. Often, it is a phase of incubation, a period where the unconscious performs its slow but persistent work of integrating what the conscious mind tried to avoid or bypass. When this internal process reaches a certain threshold, something begins to shift, not in a dramatic or loud way, but in a quiet and decisive manner. Resistance softens, pride loosens its grip. Emotional memory begins to speak more strongly than the ego's constructed narrative. What was once pushed away slowly begins to reappear in thought, feeling, and reflection. This is the moment where the next step is formed, not out of desperation or strategy, but out of psychological inevitability. Because at the deepest layers of the mind, emotional truth does not disappear with distance. It simply waits until denial becomes too difficult to maintain. And when that internal pressure finally shifts, movement returns, not toward the past exactly as it was, but toward the meaning it still carries. And in that way, the unconscious completes what silence originally began.